Okay, in this pod I'm going to talk about adjusting your images in the bridge, and particularly in Camera Raw. And really the idea here is that you should be able to do everything that you need to do as far as adjusting your images through Camera Raw and through the bridge. That the more this program's developed, the more it's meant to be a standalone program. Photoshop is really meant for more specialized, kind of specific uh, manipulation, cutting and pasting, and serious manipulation of images. So hopefully, if your images are shot well, you shouldn't need to do much adjustment at all. But if you want to do adjustment, then Camera Raw is the place to do it. And just to explain a little bit about the name Camera Raw is that for those of you using digital SLR cameras, hopefully you're trying this out and you're just shooting in Camera Raw. And the idea of this file format is that it's essentially a digital negative, meaning that when you shoot a JPEG or any other kind of file format with your camera is applying a color profile to it. And a color profile is a set of adjustments, brightness, contrast, color adjustment, and everything, and that's applied to that file the second that it's made. A Camera Raw image doesn't have any of that adjustment applied to it, so thus the name. It's a raw file. It doesn't have any outside adjustment done to it. And professionals, I think, like the idea that they are in control of doing all adjustments to their files rather than letting the color profile in the camera do it for them. So even though you're shooting a JPEG image, you can still open your file in Camera Raw simply by clicking on the image and right-clicking, and you notice the fourth option down is Open in Camera Raw. For those of you using Macs, if you hold down the Control button and click, you'll get this same pop-up window. So hit Open in Camera Raw, and this is the window that will appear. And there are a number of options on here, and the more you use it, of course, the more you become familiar with it. You can do things like cropping in the upper left corner. Say I want to crop out a little bit of the woods on the trees on the left hand or right hand side, so I can come in and crop that out. If I hit the enter button, then it eliminates that little bit of the trees. But more importantly, there's a number of adjustments that you can do over here in the right hand column that are going to be very important. And just one of the basic things to keep in mind when you're adjusting images is that when I look at this image, I'm seeing a scale of tones, from solid black to solid white. And you notice that this scale up here in the top, it's called a histogram, is kind of a graphical representation of that. And I find, after using Photoshop for a while, that histogram is really very useful, because it's really just that. I mean, it's giving you a graphic representation of all the tones that are in the image. This one happens to have this kind of spike towards the bottom because you've got a lot of dark tones in the leaves and the trees in the background. So you notice if I grab the exposure slider and move it around, look at the histogram on top. If I move it towards darker, then it's pushing all those tones towards the left-hand side, towards the black side of the spectrum. If I go the other way, it's pushing them over to the right. And you notice that when I push them way over to one side or the other, that they run off of that scale, that you have that flat edge over on the right-hand side. Or if I do the opposite over here, they run off the left edge. That's something you don't want to see. And you notice that when you look at the image, it's very dark. So anytime you look at a histogram, you want to preferably have a scale of tones that are existing somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. And another way to kind of test the image visually rather than graphically is to look at the very darkest and the very lightest areas. So here's this hair in this kind of shadow area, or these white shirts. on these two gentlemen, that part right over there in particular, because the sun's coming from that direction. I want to be able to see a gradation of tone in every area within the image, even the very darkest and the very lightest areas. That's kind of a general rule of thumb. What I don't want to see is things like this, where the white in that shirt has blown out to the point where there's no distinction of tone from one area to the other. Look at the tie and the shirt have now kind of blended into one solid plane. That's something you do not want to see in an image. And conversely, with really dark areas, you want to avoid having dark areas get to the point where they're just solid black and there's no distinction of tone. Now, his hair is pretty dark, so I could do something like go down here to fill light and try putting in just a little bit of fill so that I can still make out some kind of separation in those dark areas, and that's going to help out a lot. Now I'm going to go back and pull that exposure down just a little bit, bring some tone back into those shirts, make sure that we've got plenty of good definition there. And then one of the next things I'm going to do is go up and look at this grayscale setting. One of the first things I'm going to do is click on this convert to grayscale. You know, with the first few assignments, I'm asking you to make your images black and white, and this is really the best way that you can do this. There's several ways you can go about converting a color image to black and white, but this is by far the most versatile because you notice that when I convert it, you've got all these different sliders for the various channels, the color channels within the image. If you've watched your tutorials on lynda.com, then you know about color images, are broken down into black and white channels. And when I convert it to grayscale, then you can start pushing some of these sliders around and just seeing what portion of the area changes. Notice that there's a lot of red tones in their faces, so it's lightening up their faces slightly. Or obviously if I go to green, because there was a lot of greens in those leaves, you're going to see that change in the background quite a bit. But I'm using the same basic principles here that I was with the color images. I want to make sure I've got a good range of tones in all the areas within the image. And also, if I go up to my preview button here, I can click back to see it in its original form. I think this is really helpful because the more you adjust, the more you kind of forget how it looked in its original state. And I can compare the two and try to create a black and white version that is as close as possible to the color version. Once I feel like I have that, I can go back and check on anything else that I want to do. If I'm happy with it, then I can either say done and it will close the image and I'm finished, or I can go to open image and it will open it in Photoshop. Okay, so now here we are in Photoshop, and one little side note here, and that is just to mention the importance of making sure that your screen is calibrated. I don't know if you have the opportunity from where you are to calibrate your screen, but if you can, that's a really important step in this process, because your screen may not look the same as my screen, and my screen may not look the same as somebody else's screen. And this is especially important when you're working with people like printers or graphic designers and your screen is way out of calibration. You adjust everything for color, grayscale, curves, all that kind of stuff, and then they open it on their machine and it looks totally different. So calibrating your monitor is very important. But now that we're in the Photoshop environment, there's still some things that you might want to do to the image, and now that you're in Photoshop, I can orient you to a few of those. For the most part, anything you would really want to do as far as continuing in this sort of adjustment to levels and cropping and so forth, you're going to find under the image menu, and particularly under adjust. So you see here that you've got brightness, contrast, levels, curves, exposure. Those are all the same basic functions that you are getting in the Camera Raw window. Personally, I like levels. I think although exposure is very versatile, it has a number of the same options that you had in Camera Raw as far as exposure, gamma correction, that can really help you adjust your image to look exactly the way you want it to. So you should never be in a situation where you end up with an image that doesn't look exactly the way you want to, because you've got a number of options. I'm adjusting slightly right now to look at this is a very subtle distinction. He's wearing a white tie and a white shirt, but you still want to make sure that you see some distinction between the two, so I'm making sure I hang on to that. I'll click OK on that. But I'm going to show you one little trick that I've learned that I find very helpful, and that is sometimes you want to crop something out of the picture. Let's say I want to crop a little bit more. I don't like that little seam on his pocket right there. It's right at the edge of the frame. It feels a little kind of distracting. I'm going to crop out a little bit more of his coat to get rid of that. So if I click on the marquee tool, normally if I'm going to crop, I could simply click and drag on that, pull it down to crop that out. But the problem with cropping like that is that, of course, I'm getting rid of the thing I want to get rid of, but I'm also getting rid of a lot of the other parts of the image. And perhaps I don't want to do that. There might be other parts up here that I really like and want to leave in here, and I might sacrifice them just in order to get rid of one little element. So I've figured out a way to do that that's really helpful, and that is if I open my layers palette. Now layers is a whole other concept, and we're not going to get too heavy into it right now, but and notice that on the back, it's the layer that we're looking at is considered the background layer, and also notice it has a little lock symbol on it. So oftentimes with the background, the actions that you can do on it are limited. So in order to make this into a regular layer, I'm simply going to double click on it. A new layer window will pop up, and I can say OK. That turns it into layer 0. And now I can go to the edit menu and transform. When I go to transform, there's a number of things you can do here: rotate, scale, all this stuff. But the thing that I'm most interested in is I'm going to be able to crop this in a certain way. I'm going to try distort. And what distort does is, notice that if I grab the corner here and pull it out a little bit, that it's doing just that. It's distorting the image. Now obviously if I grab this and yank it way out, it's going to make the image look really funny. They're going to be noticeably kind of stretched. But if I grab that and pull it out just a tiny bit, just enough to get rid of that seam, I hit enter to complete the action, and that's what it looks like. Here's another little trick that's good to know. If I go to the edit menu and undo, or Control Z, that's a real easy key command to use. I use that a lot. Control Z, so I'll do that. Control Z. Oops. Get rid of that. Control Z. So that's what it looked like before. That's what it looked like after the move. So yes, it's been distorted slightly, but not enough to make them look abnormal. Nobody's going to look at this image and say, wait a minute, something's stretched and funny about it. So I find this a very useful way of cropping in order to keep as much as possible in the image.